Welcome back to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about the defense bill that was passed, possible Trump indictment, and whistleblower testimony. I want to start, since I missed last week, talking about the CPI numbers that came out last week. These are the inflation numbers. So last Wednesday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its latest Consumer Price Index, or CPI, report. So again, that is the measure of what consumers pay for certain goods that they buy. There's a basket of goods that they measure the prices, kind of average it out, and that is what the CPI is. And prices increased just 0.2% from May to June. Prices increased 3% year over year. This is the lowest annual rate since March 2021. At the same time, wage growth outpaced the rate of inflation by 1.2%. So what that means is that wages were actually growing faster than the price of goods, than inflation. So the buying power, the purchasing power of consumers went up over the last month. Core inflation, which is, again, the basket of goods, except this time it excludes all food and fuel costs because those fluctuate so much. Core inflation slowed to 4.8%. In June, it was 5.3%, so that went down as well. Also, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported the next day the Producer Price Index, the PPI. And the PPI is, instead of measuring what consumers spend on certain goods, it's measuring what suppliers or wholesalers are charging. So a place like Costco or Walmart, what are they buying for goods? And what it's seen as kind of a preview of the CPI number, because the producers, the suppliers, the wholesalers are having to spend the money first before it, and then they pass that cost off to consumers. So if the PPI is high, it's likely that the future CPI number is going to be high as well. Well, the PPI rose just 0.1% month over month in June, and producer prices were up only 0.1% year over year in June, down from 0.9% in May. Again, this is the lowest year over year rate, except this time since August 2020. So the inflation numbers, the picture that they painted, again, this was 2 weeks ago basically, the picture that they painted was one of inflation going down, something that I have been saying for a while now, that inflation is going down. It has been going down. And what a lot of people are speculating is that the Fed is still going to raise rates next meeting, but because of the numbers being what they were, that they are unlikely, or at least the speculation is that now they're less likely to raise rates going into the future. Moving on to the defense bill that was passed by the House of Representatives. So last Friday, the House of Representatives passed an $886 billion defense policy bill. The vote was 219 to 210, with just 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats crossing party lines. So this bill was the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, for fiscal year 2024. And this bill would authorize a 5.2% pay raise for troops, funding for new barracks, combat ships and drones, create a space national guard, and establish a new special inspector general for Ukraine security assistance to oversee audits of all U.S. aid provided to Ukraine. It would also authorize $300 million in security assistance for Ukraine and $600 million more than the Biden administration had requested to respond to security threats in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, the reason why this was news is usually this passes kind of no big deal, bipartisan effort, and they pass it and it gets through. However, if you notice again, the vote this time was 219 to 210, basically was along party lines vote. And the reason is because of some of the amendments that Republicans added to this bill. The Republicans added one amendment that would restrict the military from paying for abortions. So currently, the Pentagon currently grants troops leave and travel funds for abortions outside the states where they are stationed. So let's say there is a military soldier stationed in somewhere with restrictive abortion laws, maybe Alabama. Right now, the Pentagon will pay that woman to leave Alabama, travel to another state where they can go and have an abortion, and will pay for those travel funds and leave. Now, they cannot pay for the abortion itself, but they can pay for the funds necessary to get there to another state. So Republicans do not want that to be the case, and they added an amendment to this bill that would restrict the military's ability to do that. Another amendment would prohibit the Defense Department or TRICARE, and TRICARE is just the military's basically healthcare program. So this amendment would prevent the Department of Defense or TRICARE from providing gender-related surgeries and hormone treatments for transgender people. Another amendment would eliminate all the offices and personnel dedicated to diversity in the armed forces and prohibit government properties from hoisting up unauthorized flags taking aim at government sites that flew LGBTQ pride flags. So the reason why this passed along party lines and it was not a bipartisan effort is because of these amendments. And what you're seeing in the news is a lot of people are claiming that these are culture war amendments and that the Republicans are trying to fight the culture war in the military. And the reason why I want to talk about this is I think these are completely and totally valid amendments. Remember that the military is funded by tax dollars, right? So if taxpayers and their representatives do not want their tax dollars spent on this stuff, then to me, it is completely within the rights of the Republicans to not fund these things that their constituents disagree with. For example, abortion, right? The fact that my tax dollars are going to pay for someone to travel outside of a state to have an abortion, I think is absurd. I don't think that's right. I think they should have to do that on their own personal time, on their own personal dime. They should not, I should not be paying for that, especially if I live in a state that has more restrictive healthcare or abortion laws because I wanted that and because the voters of that state promoted that. Also, if I don't think people should get gender reassigning surgeries, then why should the tax dollars that I pay go towards people having them? Again, I don't think that's right. If I disagree with LGBTQ ideology, then why should I allow the government in the form of the military to fly the LGBTQ flag instead of the American flag or next to the American flag, right? So because these are, issues that in a democracy that we have to work out, I think it's within the right of the Republicans to pass a bill that prevents those things from being funded or from being allowed. That's what democracy looks like. And if the Democrats want to claim that this is threatening national defense because they're not going to be able to fund the military, then the solution is easy. Drop these issues. Don't allow the abortion, the travel to get an abortion to be funded. Don't allow the LGBTQ flag to be flown on military and government sites. Don't allow TRICARE and the Defense Department to pay for gender-related surgeries. Don't if you think it threatens national security. And so I think this is well within the rights of the Republicans, and I don't see a problem with them doing this. This is what they believe. This is what their constituents believe, and so they should be allowed to take the political steps necessary to make it happen. Remember, this is public funds. Now, that doesn't mean that this bill is going to be a law. In fact, it likely won't, because it's got to pass the Senate, and it's not going to pass the Senate. The Senate is working on its own version, and it will likely pass that version, and then the two sides, the House and the Senate, are going to have to work together behind closed doors, essentially, to compromise on a bill that will likely not include these amendments. So at one level, these amendments really are just for show, because they won't pass, but at the same time, they're completely valid, I think, amendments to include in there. Moving on to the federal investigation into January 6th. So this week, Trump said on social media, former President Donald Trump said on social media that he received a letter from Special Prosecutor Jack Smith giving him 4 days to report to a grand jury. So this is an indication that Donald Trump will likely be indicted on charges related to another one of Jack Smith's investigations, this one into Trump's behavior after the 2020 election and January 6th. So the letter that Jack Smith sent cites 3 potential statutes that were broken: deprivation of rights, conspiracy to commit an offense against or defraud the U.S., and tampering with a witness. So those are the statutes that the letter mentions as being possibly related to a future indictment. So Jack Smith, if he sounds familiar, that's because he's the same prosecutor that brought the indictment that I talked about a few weeks ago against Trump regarding the classified documents case. So this is the same prosecutor, but it is 2 separate cases. So not only was Jack Smith tasked with that classified documents case, but he's also been tasked with investigating January 6th, what happened, how it happened, and then Trump's role in it. So it's important to note that there is no indictment yet. Okay, so far, Trump has only been indicted for 2 different cases, and I'll talk about those in a second, but there's not been an indictment. But the reason why this is news is because usually letters like this and the opportunity for Donald Trump to testify to a grand jury, or anyone to testify in front of a grand jury, is the precursor to an indictment, which means that it is likely that Donald Trump will be indicted for something involved with January 6th and the 2020 election. Again, because we don't have an indictment, we don't have official charges, formal charges, anything like that, we don't actually know anything. We don't actually know what the evidence is and what Donald Trump specifically is being charged with, or what his role could have been, or what Jack Smith is alleging. We don't know any of that because he hasn't been officially indicted. This is just a news report. However, again, it's now looking likely that he will be indicted. And if he's indicted, then this will now be the 3rd indictment for Donald Trump. So to recap, you've got the New York case that involves hush money, the hush money payment that Donald Trump's campaign paid to Stormy Daniels. And I talked about that at the time, that essentially I think this is a very frivolous case. Okay, it's a weak case. It's one of the weakest, if not the weakest, indictments against Donald Trump. It is New York district attorney bringing those charges, alleging that Donald Trump, he paid hush money to Stormy Daniels and then lied and mislabeled it on the accounting, essentially. Then the second indictment is the classified documents case. Again, I talked about this at the time. This case and this indictment looks very, very strong and is not looking good for Donald Trump. This is him being accused of taking classified documents, mishandling them, and refusing to give the classified documents back to the federal government when asked, and then the obstruction along the way. So that is a very strong case, and it's not looking good for Donald Trump. And then this third indictment, which is, again, we don't know for sure, but is something related to January 6th and election of 2020, or could be related to that. So 3 indictments would not be good for Donald Trump. And I just want to say something real quick about this. It would be, I've seen that, because Donald Trump is being indicted basically over and over and over again, that is, people are alleging that is just the deep state or whatever coming after Donald Trump. When in reality, what it is that Donald Trump is a really skeezy, sleazy guy. And he does bad things. that borderline break the law. And as a result, he gets caught. And when he gets caught, he then claims and plays the victim. Okay? This is just the reality of when you don't play by the rules, or when you break the law, or even, test breaking the law. This is what happens. I don't think this is corruption from the federal government and them after Donald Trump. I think this is the result and the consequence of Donald Trump not obeying the law in many instances. On the other side of the aisle, with the Biden administration, they were in the news with the IRS whistleblowers that testified this week on Wednesday. So on Wednesday, Gary Shapley and his deputy, Joseph Ziegler, testified under oath before the GOP-led House Committee on Oversight and Accountability. So Shapley and Ziegler, they are IRS whistleblowers that claimed IRS investigators and Department of Justice officials went around normal procedure to treat Hunter Biden with inappropriate leniency. So this is all about Hunter Biden's scandal that I mentioned a few weeks ago. If you remember, Hunter Biden signed a plea deal where he essentially admitted to charges related to not paying money, not paying taxes, but then the gun charges against him were dropped. And if you remember, that whole investigation was about kind of Hunter Biden in general and narrowed to those two charges. But the investigation broadly was looking at not only just those charges of tax evasion and gun charges, but also his dealings with foreign governments and potential, corruption by using his Biden name and possibly his influence and selling that to foreign officials. So that was the broad investigation, but then narrowed to the tax evasion and gun charges. Well, what Shapley and Ziegler, these IRS whistleblowers, are alleging is that it narrowed inappropriately. That really the federal government, okay, so basically this is the Biden administration, got involved and made sure that the process was slowed down in some instances to make sure that some of the charges were past the statutes of limitations for those charges. They also discouraged, according to these whistleblowers, the IRS team from investigating the possible involvement of Joe Biden in Hunter Biden's business dealings. And that so basically the Biden administration obstructed this investigation, obstructed the investigation into Hunter Biden. That's what is being alleged and was alleged by these whistleblowers. And it's important to note that these whistleblowers were testifying under oath. So this is at risk of perjury, okay, that they're saying these things. This isn't just they're going on the news and claiming these things where they won't be held liable if they're lying. But they are specifically under oath saying that this happened. So this is a big deal. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all to the story, right? There are two people, maybe they, and there's in all likelihood more to the story that A, they don't know, and B, that, maybe from their point of view, it looked this way, but there's other reasons for it happening. So we can't jump to conclusions and say that the Biden administration is corrupt, but this doesn't look good, right? And if what they're alleging is true, that the Biden administration did basically obstruct the investigation into Hunter Biden, that is corruption to the utmost degree, right? That is absurd. That is impeachable. That is Biden should have to resign. Like, that is a really big deal and a huge controversy and scandal if it's true. But again, if it's true. Now, according to the whistleblowers, that the obstruction, because of the obstruction, there are holes in the final investigation. So, for example, there was a text message that's been making rounds in the media from Hunter Biden to a Chinese businessman where he says basically that, he's next to his father, and unless the Chinese businessman wants to pay him or pays him, that the guy sitting next to him, Joe Biden, is going to hold a grudge, okay? Now, this looks really bad, right? It looks like, just on its surface, that Hunter Biden is with Joe Biden, and they're scheming up how to make this businessman from China pay them. But We don't actually know if that's true, right? If Hunter Biden was just saying that Joe Biden was right next to him, we don't know where Joe Biden was at that time. However, the whistleblowers say, okay, so we learned that, we see that text, so the next step should have been to check the location for the location data for Joe Biden. But they, according to the whistleblowers, weren't allowed access to that location information. So again, that is again would be a huge scandal, right? If this text is, and if we see this and we have this text, right? This text says, the guy sitting next to me in an allusion to Joe Biden. And if we have data about where Joe Biden was at that time, then, and the Biden administration prevented that data from being accessed, as they're alleging, that would be a really big scandal. But again, we're just kind of taking them at their word at this point. They also argued that Hunter should have faced harsher charges than the ones he pled guilty to, but the U.S. Attorney David Weiss, the one that was over the plea deal, didn't have the freedom to do so. Okay, whether that's because he was restricted by his higher-ups, whatever it is, he didn't have the freedom to do so. Again, this is what the whistleblowers are alleging. So, it's important to remember here that the U.S. Department of Justice, the Department of Justice in general, is a branch. It's part of the executive branch. So Joe Biden is over the Department of Justice. Okay, it's not a fourth branch of government. It doesn't stand outside of government. Okay, so Joe Biden is the leader, the boss, the guy in charge of the Department of Justice. And what these allegations are saying, that as boss, as the guy in charge, instead of allowing independence and kind of removing himself from the process, and or the other higher-ups of the Department of Justice, removing them from the process, he got involved, and those officials got involved for political reasons and obstructed the investigation. That, again, is a huge deal if it's true. More needs to come out. There needs to be more information because right now we have the word of two people, right? And that just isn't enough to make bold declarations of corruption. Moving on to international news. So on Monday, Russia withdrew from a deal brokered by Turkey and the United Nations last year that had allowed for the safe export of more than 30 million tons of Ukrainian grain across the Black Sea. So the Kremlin said that the other side, the Western world essentially, was not being upheld. The Western side of this deal was not being upheld because they placed sanctions on Russia. That as a result, they basically were justified in pulling out of this deal. The reason why this is such a big deal is because so much of the world's grain comes from Ukraine. In particular, and I'll get to this in a second, in countries close to geographically Ukraine and more reliant on Ukrainian grain, such as those in Africa. So Russia pulls out from this deal that guaranteed basically the safe passage of grain coming to and from Ukraine. They pull out of the deal, but they also announced, and this is, I think, even the bigger deal, they also announced that it would consider any commercial ships, not trips, commercial ships bound for Ukraine's Black Sea ports to be legitimate military targets. So then, these are commercial ships. These are not military ships, but Russia announced that it would consider any commercial ship bound for Ukraine's Black Sea ports to be legitimate military targets, meaning they could be attacked, they could be justified in being attacked. So again, I mentioned the reliance of Africa, the continent of Africa, and countries in particular like Egypt, that this is going to have on them. Because they are so reliant on Ukrainian grain, that means that the price of grain, really worldwide, is going to go up, but in particular, it's going to limit the access that these countries have in grain. So it's going to really impact those countries like Egypt in Northern Africa and the Middle East. Now, I point that out in particular North Africa because there's potential consequences to that, right? So if you think about something I've alluded to before, and we'll probably talk about at length in the future, is that North Africa right now is really seeing a resurgence, an upsurgence of radical Islamic terrorists, okay? Groups like ISIS are really growing and taking power over in North Africa. Well, those groups thrive in areas of need, of poverty, of destitution. I mean, those are the areas that these groups like ISIS thrive. And so if the price of grain and wheat skyrockets and people can't get access to it, then that's going to leave a lot of despair, which again is in the very area where these groups are currently resurging. So that could be potentially catastrophic for that region, which again could or could not be detrimental to the national security of the United States. The less safe spaces in the world that groups like ISIS have to not be worried, to be relaxed, to be safe and plan, the safer the United States is. So we want to limit the amount of area in the world that is true. This situation with the grain in North Africa could make it so that there's more and more of that area that they are safe in. Finally, China GDP numbers. So China's GDP, gross domestic product, grew by just 0.8% in the second quarter compared with the previous 3 months. That number was 6.3% higher from the same quarter last year. So year over year, it grew 6.3%, which sounds like a good number. However, that is largely because a year ago, China was still in basically full-fledged lockdown from COVID, and there were zero COVID policies. So the baseline, the floor was so low that, of course, they grew 6.3%, which is why the number from how much did they grow from last quarter is so important, that 0.8%, because that is not a high number. So what we see is that GDP, the economy of China, not growing very fast at all. In fact, the GDP number, that 0.8%, fell short of what economists were estimating. They were expecting a little bit stronger of a rebound from the zero COVID policies being taken away, and that rebound didn't necessarily come. In particular, the Chinese property sector has been facing a significant slowdown. That has been a drag on the whole economy, as investment in property has dropped and housing prices have flatlined. So this is one of those areas in the Chinese economy that has been largely subsidized. That the middle class in China has basically had to subsidize the development of property, of the building of houses, things like that. And basically they've been promised that their house will continue to increase in price as the economy grows. What we see, though, is that's not the case. Okay, and this is why, as I've said over and over and over again, the way that the Chinese economy grew so fast is by market reforms. They grew because they allowed the market to, they opened up the market for other countries and other companies around the world to invest in China. They did not regulate and they did not centralize to the point that they are now. So under Xi Jinping, he has centralized the economy, which means that other countries and companies in other countries don't want to invest in China if they don't know whether they're going to be allowed to maintain their freedom or not, or if they're going to be regulated out of existence. So they don't want to invest in China. And as I said over and over again, a centralized economy does not work. So while it seems like China is this strong, powerful country, the more they centralize, the more brittle they get. And we see that in the economy. It's not a strong economy. And it's not a strong economy because they do not allow the market to work like they once did. And as a result, you cannot have a prosperous, successful economy. And so while the Chinese are certainly a threat to the United States, the threat should incentivize us to continue to promote free market policies, because that's what has created our economy to be what it is today. The more we kind of centralize or have the government involved in picking and choosing winners and losers in the economy, like China does, then the more like China economically we become, and, as we see here, the worse our economy is for it. And with that, that is the end of the podcast this week. I hope you like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make this podcast go far and wide, and I hope you return next week.